Well, now that we have a technique to identify outliers, either based on the mean and standard deviation or based on the quartiles, how do we represent that on a box plot? On this box plot, anything beyond this limit would be considered an outlier. And we're going to describe the outlier by using an X or an asterisk, just to show the position where the outlier would be. So this is going to be a fundamental part of your box plot from now on. You lose marks instantly if you haven't represented outliers, or if you haven't even shown that you've calculated to check whether there's outliers. There may not be any, but you need to be able to demonstrate that you've done the check ahead of time. If there are, you've represented them with this X, and if there aren't, you've gone ahead and stated there are no outliers. Well, if you're considering specific values to be outliers, where do you then draw the top or the maximum value for your box plot? This needs to be amended. We need to mark this somewhere else. We're now going to mark this at the next available valid value. What I mean here is that we'll go for the second biggest number, as long as it wasn't also an outlier. So we'll go for the biggest number that is not an outlier. Inversely, if there were outliers at the bottom end, we'll go for the smallest number that is not an outlier. And that's where we're going to draw the endpoint whisker for the box plot. Okay, so here we also want to cover how would we make comparisons between two box plots. Firstly, if there's two box plots, they should be plotted against the same number line. So we can actually and proportionally see how things are different to each other. So if we wanted to compare the prices of houses in Battersea with the houses in Chelsea, there's for a 2-mark question, there's 2 things that we definitely need to state. We need to say one thing about the spread, one thing about a measure of spread. There's only 2 measures of spread in a box plot. We have the range and we have the interquartile range. And as we've spoke about already, the interquartile range is the stronger of the 2 to use, particularly when there are extreme values. Alright, so just make a statement about the interquartile range. The interquartile range of the house prices in Chelsea is greater than the houses in Battersea. Secondly, we want to make a comment about a measure of location. Now, technically, there's lots of measures of location. We have the median, the upper quartile, the lower quartile, the maximum, the minimum. But the best of these to reference is the median. Talk about the median. Which one has the larger median? Which one has the smaller median? And obviously write it in context. The median house price in Chelsea was greater than the median house price in Battersea. As you can probably guess, talking about the maximum or the minimum doesn't get you a lot of credit. And in the majority of mark schemes, there's actually no marks for referencing maximum and minimum, only if the examiner's being particularly lenient. If there's a third thing that you're to talk about, that will be the presence of outliers. So it might be that one distribution has outliers and the other one doesn't. Or they might both have outliers, while one has them at the top end of the data, the other has them at the lower end of the data. One of them might have 3 outliers, so 3 extreme values, while the other one only has 1 or none. So these are the comments that you want to try and make when you're comparing different data sets. So let's go through a quick example of how you would construct comparative box plots and what kind of comments you can make to compare them. So in the earlier part of the question, we were given this data around females and their blood glucose levels, and we constructed this box plot. Now in this part, we've been given some additional information, and this is for us to construct a box plot for the males. First thing we'll do is we'll check whether or not they're outliers. So interquartile range ends up being 1.1, and we know we're going to check 1.5 times 1.1 above the upper quartile and similarly below the lower quartile. The lower outlier boundary is 1.95, while the upper outlier boundary is 5.25. So any data outside of those we would consider to be outliers. Let's go back to our minimum and maximum values that we'd written down. Well, the minimum is 1.4, so that's an outlier. It's below the lower outlier boundary, or beyond the lower outlier boundary. Let's check at the top. The maximum was 5.2. Well, that's actually fine. That's within the boundary. It was lower than 5.25. So we do have one outlier, and that's 1.4. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mark 1.4 as an outlier, but I don't know what the next smallest value was. I'm unsure what the smallest value within the acceptance region is because I don't have the original raw data. So in this case, I'm going to set the whisker for the minimum value. I'm going to set it as the outlier boundary. I'm going to use 1.95. So if we don't have that information, if I don't know the specific value that was being used, I can just go ahead and use the outlier boundary. Okay, apart from that, all of the other markers I can put on: the lower quartile, the median, the upper quartile, and the maximum value. And then I just construct my box plot as usual. Here's the box, and here's the whiskers. I'm just going to go ahead and put some numerical values on each of these key points so we can use them if we're going to make any comparisons between the box plots. Here in part C of the question, we're asked to compare the blood glucose levels for males and females. So this is exactly what I'm talking about. We can go and say straight away something about a measure of spread. In this case, we're going to talk about the interquartile range. The interquartile range is smaller for the females. My interpretation of this is that their blood glucose levels are more consistent. There's less variability between their blood glucose levels. Additionally, I'll comment that the median for the females is lower than the median for the males. So I've made one comment about the spread, one comment about the location of the median, and I could also go on to say that they both have outliers. So in that order of priority, say something about the spread, something about the location, and then something about your outliers. Okay, and we're just about finished, but before you move on to some practice questions, let's take a quick look at the specification and exactly what it is that students are expected to be able to show, exactly what the examiners are anticipating you will be confident on. While you read through that, I want to quickly remind you that it will be sensible for you to come back and watch this video at a later date, maybe come back in 2 or 3 weeks or before an assessment. And as you watch through the second time round, because you've done your practice, a lot of what you go through here should resonate with you much more. And you have a chance to really embed your understanding of the difficult concepts, the ones that have been flagged up as A star.